Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. Today's episode is going to be The Projection of the Astral Body by Sylvan Muldoon. Before we get to that, I have a couple interesting announcements. First of all, I'm going to be offering now 2 videos every week. Y'all talked me into it. So there'll be this usual video that will occur on Saturdays, like you're used to, but there will also be videos that I will post at Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time in the United States. So you can work out whatever time that is for you. The key thing is just make sure you're subscribed with your notification bell on. That way you'll get the notification and you can take advantage of that extra video. So I want to provide more content, more things are coming, and this once a week just isn't enough. So get ready for it. Secondly, of course, there's Patreon. If you'd like to support, let's face it, the important work of Astral Club. There are so many people out there who are beginning to astral project, who have questions, have fears, and together we have helped to allay the fears rather, of these people and to increase the knowledge of astral projection. Knowledge that had been, for the most part, lost for thousands of years from the minds and the history of mankind. And we're together helping to bring that back to help mankind realize his true potential, that we've shut off a huge portion of our potential for so long. And now we're finally getting it back again. And I'm glad to do what little I can. And with everyone's support, we can, in our own way, help to better the world that we've created here. And I think one of the ways to do that is to help people realize that there is more to the human race than just what we can see with our physical eyes. That there's knowledge and there's wisdom out there that's just waiting for us to get out there and look for it and find it, and to bring it back and to integrate it back into our racial memory. With Patreon, you get videos with no commercials. There's an email within the Patreon system where we can talk back and forth. That happens on a regular basis. People have questions, or we just email back and forth. I also give Patreon members priority on comments and suggestions. So this is actually one of the suggestions I've had from Patreon people, about a second video each week. So if it's something you're interested in, there'll be a link in the description. Let's talk about the subject now of this video. Everyone who has listened to me for any length of time knows that one of my main influences in astral projection was Robert Monroe. He was a great man. And for the first 11 years of my life, I thought I was the only person who astral projected. And then in 1972, I ran across his seminal work, Journeys Out of the Body. And we've talked about it extensively. And, and I still have a treasured memory that I'll never forget of the time I went to his institute in Virginia. And I was able to talk and have a conversation with him in the mid 80s. And it's something I'll never forget. The man was a genius, but he was also very approachable and friendly, and just had this scientific mind that was just so powerful. But we're not talking about him today. Today we're talking about someone who I didn't discover until I was out of college. The book itself, The Projection of the Astral Body, written by Sylvan Muldoon, was published back in 1929 when Sylvan was only 26 years old. He was born in 1903 and he lived to 1969. Now, I didn't discover this book to, a reprint many years later in, I think, 1986. But when I read this book, it also had a very powerful effect on me. It's written in the fashion that books were at that time. Their manner of speaking, I think, is more genteel than a little bit more formal than what we are used to nowadays. But I went through a phase where I was buying all these different occult books, and many of them were written during that time period, and I just was very attracted to it. But more than that, the information. He put it forth in a straightforward, no nonsense way that really appealed to me. And he didn't have all of this extra spiritual weirdness that was very common during that time period. There was a lot of seances that would go on, and many of them were run by crooked mediums. But the things that he talked about were things that I had experienced and that I had never seen written down in any form anywhere before, except for on my scrawled notes on my yellow notepads. So as I consumed this book, it became one of my favorite of all time astral projection books. And so I think it's definitely worth an episode of its own. And I'm going to read from a few portions of it. And I'm going to add my own comments to it and some stories that I know from my own experience, from some other historical experience. And I think you'll find that it might just be a book that you'll want to get your hands on at some time in the near future. The first part that I want to read to you really appeals to me because I really identify with what he's talking about here. Because he started having experiences young as well. And he says in his preface, "When my first out-of-the-body experiences occurred, I was but 12, so young and immature in mind that I did not realize their magnitude. The occurrences came about involuntarily. He didn't mean to project, neither did I. It was just something that happened, and repeated themselves frequently until he became so accustomed to them that, as a matter of fact, he soon regarded it as nothing extraordinary, and he seldom mentioned it to members of his own family, which was the same with me. There was also the fear of being ridiculed too, but maybe he had a more open-minded. In the 20s, and perhaps even earlier in the 1910s, there was this resurgence of the occult. And there were seances and spiritism. H.G. Wells got involved in it. So in a weird way, things were probably more open back then than where I grew up at my age. At any rate, it happened so often that he didn't even talk about it with members of his family, much like I did. He even sometimes didn't bother to keep records of it because it happened so often to him. Now, he had been told by persons professing to know that conscious projection of the astral body was nothing unusual, and that many psychics could produce it at will. He, too, wanted to be able to produce it at will, so he became envious of those who he had heard could do so. So he began to search for people who could do this, and his search proved fruitless. And thus he began to experiment with the phenomenon himself. And this book talks about his experiments. I've heard people, too, claim, oh, I can produce an astral projection whenever I feel like it. I have yet to believe anyone who could demonstrate that they could just say, "Oh, I want to astral project right now." Well, I'm totally conscious. I have yet to find anyone who I believe can actually do that, and it looks to me like my man Sylvan Muldoon here 100 years ago wasn't having any more luck either. Now, he goes on to say that although we're living in the 20th century, we still have intolerance of the Middle Ages. So, okay, he did encounter some, pushback. And I am not optimistic enough to believe that a great many will read without prejudice what I have to say. Okay, I mean, he's writing this down, but he's concerned that people will think he's crazy, a liar. Believe me, I can identify with those emotions and thoughts as well. Uh, I have written this work with the idea of giving the results of my findings to other students of the occult. And remember, back then, the occult is how all of these types of spiritual sciences were referred to. I mean, occult simply means hidden. That's really all it means. Unfortunately, many occultists are of the belief that what is claimed to be a conscious astral projection is nothing more or less than a dream. And that's unfortunately still a common assumption made by people who don't know any better, who haven't educated themselves. And I've made videos as to how can you tell a dream from a lucid dream from an astral projection. They each have very distinct circumstances about them, and you can tell if you're educated which experience you're actually having. Now, they can bleed. Many times you can have a regular dream and then bleed. All of a sudden you become conscious, and now it's a lucid dream. And then through some of the techniques that I've mentioned in the past, like jumping off a high building or a mountain or something and inducing that sensation of falling while concentrating on leaving your body, you can then actually project. So they are different, but you can transition through them. But evidently, this book was written, geez, almost 100 years ago, but many things have stayed the same. But I think they're getting better. He says people will say, "I want proof, the objective proof. Then I will believe it." I've heard the same thing. And the projector replies, "You cannot have objective proof. You must experience it. Then you will have the proof." My brother was my biggest skeptic. And it wasn't until he called me one day and said he'd had a projection. He'd left his body. He'd stood there looking at his sleeping self with the drool coming out, lying next to his wife. And then he walked outside. And then that was the end of the experience. But he was profoundly shaken by that experience because my brother is very much a show me type, prove me type. And I've always thought, much like Mr. Muldoon thought, that in order, I believe, and he believed, to truly 100% believe in astral projection, you must experience it for yourself. You can have 98% belief in what I'm saying here to you, and I'm flattered. But you'll never have 100% until you experience it for yourself. And that's what all this is about. Yes, I tell you about my experiences. I tell you about what's possible. I tell you the ins and the outs. I show you ways that you can avoid making some of the mistakes that I made. And these are all notes of the road. I'm giving you a map. I'm giving you, cliff notes or road notes that you can use to avoid making the wrong turns and ending up in dead-end roads. But you have to get in the car and you have to drive for yourself. Because it's not enough just to read my travel log. You've got to experience it for yourself. So he said he stands on this issue. He says, experience it. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. Nice old-fashioned saying there. And I couldn't agree more with that statement. I want people not just listening to me, not just being fascinated by what I have to say, but becoming actual astral projectors. And then helping others to become astral projectors. And that it spreads and spreads, like COVID, only good. So that more and more people can do it, and we can enter a new phase in mankind's evolution. Now, I could spend hours and hours and hours talking about all the different wisdom here in this book. We're not going to do that in this particular episode. I'm going to talk about his chapter 2, where he talks about different ways, methods, systems, occurrences that can lead to astral projection. And I can verify just about all of these. There's one that I can't, and I consider myself lucky, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And we'll start with the first one. Now, he calls it astral catalepsy, which he means you find yourself, your physical body, in a state where you can't move. That's a cataleptic state. Most astral projections occur in that state. The body, the brain, in order to protect itself, when it gets ready to dream, it causes the muscles and the nervous system to essentially become dormant, because it doesn't want you to act out your dreams and injure yourself. Now, I think I've a couple of times that's failed, and I've ended up knocking over a lamp or something next to my bed, which is why I usually keep it further away. It doesn't happen very often. But normally your body you find yourself in that state, and we've all found ourselves in that state, where you're aware, but you can't move. Now, most people, or many people at least, panic. And they start freaking out, and they waste the opportunity. But if you can remain calm and realize that if you're awake but find that you can't move, this is the ideal state in which to project from. Now you must will yourself to float out of your body, or to roll out of your body. Or if these things aren't working for you, try to will yourself to another location. It's hard. If I could communicate telepathically, I could tell you how to do this in a better way. But unfortunately, English is a very limited language, and this is the best I can tell you. Now, keep in mind, when I say roll out or float out, or obviously I'm not talking about moving your physical body. We're talking about moving your astral body out of coincidence. And this is the primary way that it's done in what he calls the astral cataleptic state. Now, one of the types of projection that isn't talked about very often, although I have mentioned it at times, is what he calls astral somnambulism, which in other words is astral sleepwalking. It's unconscious projections. These occur all the time, and it's one of the reasons why I tell people not to be freaked out by these irrational fears of being possessed the minute you leave coincidence, or your astral body leaves coincidence with your physical body. Because if that was going to happen, it would have happened to all of us. we'd all have our heads turning around, spitting out pea soup and calling on the devil and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And it happens when we're in an unconscious state. And for some reason, we just leave the body. It could be an unconscious desire. You've been thinking about someone, so you unconsciously project yourself to them. Or you're thirsty and you end up unconsciously projecting to where the sink is. And then you wake up the next morning with a vague dream of trying to draw some water, but you couldn't because you couldn't touch the faucet. That's unconscious, or what he calls astral somnambulism. Then he gets into distant point projection. This is something that I usually caution new projectors about because, I mean, maybe I'm prejudiced, but my first many projections occurred with me just rolling out of my body onto the floor and occasionally floating out of my body and being still very close to my physical body when I did it. Distant point projection is more difficult normally. So, I would tell new people to try to avoid that unless they are failing at the more common methods, because it requires a little bit more astral experience and more concentration. Now, there is an exception to that. I began all of my astral projections at my childhood home. My parents are still alive, and that's great. And they still live in my childhood home. So many times I find myself projecting. And when I regain, I have that short period of blackness. And when I regain my consciousness, I'm in my old bedroom in my parents' home. Now it's been changed into a different type of sitting area, but there I go. And I think what it is because of so many astral projections occurring there that now I've got this automatic reflex that just, oh, you're going to project? Okay, well, this is where we project from. So even though my childhood home is physically about 800 miles away, bam, well, what's 800 miles? That's nothing, right? Bam, that's where I start. So if you want to try distant point projection, there's no harm in it. I do suggest, though, that you must be very familiar with that distant point. You must have been there quite a bit. You must have felt comfortable there. You must have the feel of that place, which is another way of saying the ident, although that's a little bit more of an advanced concept if you're a newer projector. I've had people ask me, oh, well, can I project to the top of the Eiffel Tower? I said, well, how many times have you been to the top of the Eiffel Tower? Oh, well, never. Well, how many times have you been to Paris? Oh, I'm going to go sometime, but never. So wait a minute. You want to project to a specific spot in Paris, and you're a newer projector, and you haven't ever been there? I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying it's pretty darn unlikely. So keep that in mind. If you're going to do this, make sure you have a very great understanding of where you're going. The next part really affected me when I read it because it was exactly what I had experienced all my life as a projector. He calls it the Phantom's 3 moving speeds. The first is just natural or normal speed. And it typically happens when you're walking. So when you are walking about in the astral, you're typically walking at that speed. Next up, he calls the intermediate speed. Now, this is a speed at which the subject moves along without effort, faster than the normal speed, but not fast enough to lose perception. So, when I go flying sometimes, say I'm flying at treetop level or I'm flying over a mountain, I'm moving at a pretty good clip, but I'm not losing my consciousness and perception. I can admire, all the scenery below me. However, the third he calls supernormal traveling. Now, you've heard me discuss this quite a bit. That's when you're moving at a speed that he says is beyond comprehension. And he says it always occurs in the unconscious. And how many times have I told you that if I'm projecting far into time or space, I black out for a period of time or I become unconscious. And then when I arrive, hopefully where my goal was, that's when I gain consciousness. And he didn't really get into explaining why he thought that happens. He was just describing what he observed. And that's when you know you're dealing with somebody who knows what he's talking about. When they describe little things like this that you've experienced, you know this guy isn't just making it up as he goes along, or didn't read a book once and then thinks he knows what he's talking about. These are little things that not everybody talks about. Your accomplished astral projectors just take them as yeah, of course, that's the way it works. I personally think, and I've mentioned this before, what's happening is that you are traveling at such a high speed, whether it's through time, space, dimensions, what have you, that your conscious mind cannot absorb the stimuli that is just raining down upon your poor conscious mind. It's just not designed to deal with that level of information being hurled at it. It kind of reminds me of, imagine if you had a television and instead of watching it at normal speed, you might have 2, maybe 3 channels where you could watch at a normal speed, and you could probably, have a decent shot at keeping up with what's happening on those 3 different programs. But imagine now that you were confronted with a billion television programs all happening at the same time, and you literally were trying to watch them all and absorb what was going on. You couldn't. You'd probably eventually just black out because it would be too much stimulus. Your consciousness wouldn't be able to handle it. But those are the 3 basic speeds that you're going to find. I remember when the first time, I started out just walking around as a kid. Then eventually I discovered that you could fly. And when I flew at treetop level, I was a little scared of heights when I was younger, so I'd get as high as like the treetop level. And I'd move at that faster speed, but still okay. But then I remember the first time I wished to go to the moon. And anyone who's ever wished to go to the moon can back me up on this. You start hurtling at the moon at an unbelievable rate. And either you black out for a second or your fear kicks up to such an extent that you end up back in your body because you move at such a rate that, you're saying, I want to be on the moon. So your astral engine kicks in and says, okay, let's be on the moon in the next second. And bam, you are moving at a high rate of speed. Now, there's another way, a couple other ways that he talks about that are true, but it's not something I would typically recommend. He's just describing other ways. One is what he calls morbidity, which when you're in a weakened state, when your physical body is isn't really in a state that it can easily move about. Maybe you're sick, maybe you've undergone some level of paralysis or what have you. So what happens is inside your body, you're building up this desire to move, and it's constantly frustrated by a physical body which is unable to move. So in certain cases, people will find themselves exteriorizing, as he mentioned, and having an astral projection. So if you are in that type of a stage, that type of a situation, perhaps you can take advantage of it. Obviously, I'm not going to recommend anyone makes themselves sick or enters into any sort of paralytic state, because that would be stupid. Now, this next one is very interesting. It's called Instantaneous Astral Exteriorization. A violent blow, especially one to the head, or an extreme shock wherein unconsciousness ensues as a consequence, is another example of instantaneous astral projection. Now, I have a real story around that. Ernest Hemingway, the famous American writer, served as an ambulance driver, a voluntary ambulance driver. He signed up during the Spanish Civil War. He was helping the Republican side. And of course, being an ambulance driver meant that you had to get up close and personal with where the wounded were, which was generally near the front lines. So one time he was going with his crew to pick up some wounded soldier when an artillery shell landed very close by. He reports that he was thrown somewhere like 20 feet or something like that into the air and then slammed back down again and lost consciousness. He then reported that he had this odd experience where he was floating above his body and looking down at his crumpled form below, and wondering if he was dead or what was going on. And then eventually he regained consciousness, and his astral body went back inside. He never really understood the experience, but I remember reading about it in his works, and I note things like that. So, Ernest Hemingway. Now, do I recommend a violent blow to the head or being thrown 20 feet in the air because an artillery shell lands nearby to astral project? No, that would be a bad idea. But it is something that can trigger an astral projection. He mentions a couple of other, what I consider very similar types of projections. You have a misstep on the stairs. You have a collision. Even being disturbed when you're sleeping in bed and you make a sudden movement. Any of these sudden and, to one degree or another, violent effects on your physical body can have the effect of temporarily forcing your astral body to be out of coincidence of the physical body. These all fall under his definition of unconscious projection. There's more, but I'm going to end up with his final comment where he's talking about how many conscious projections are ruined at the outset merely because the person involved has an unpleasant sensation, something that turns into a negative emotion. And he mentions some of the emotions that he has experienced or I guess learned from others, and I can back all of them up. Emotions of unpleasantness. So you're not pleased by what's happening. Alarm, fear, which are pretty much the same thing. I mean, I've heard many stories about people who had a projection and then thought they were dead, and then bam, they were back in again. And if you have a wish to be normal, look, I don't want to experience this. I just want to be normal. Bam, you'll find yourself back in coincidence with your body again. I came across some some little girl who was talking about astral projection on a TikTok site, and bless her, she's trying her best, but she really didn't know what she was talking about. And because one of her main problems, she said, about astral projection was being able to get back into your body. Now, anyone who makes that statement, and I'm always willing to consider alternate ideas and opinions if someone can back it up about astral projection. But anyone who has ever astral projected knows that if there's anything in the world that is not a problem associated with astral projection, is not being able to get back into your body. Getting back into your body is all too easy. Any one of these emotions will get you back in there again. We've talked frequently about fear, for instance, how you must master your fear. There's a billion different ways to get pulled back into your body. The hardest part about astral projection is mastering the ability and refining your will, your force of will to stay out of your body. Having some young girl talking about, oh, the problem is getting back in. First of all, that's just going to cause fear. Next, it's just wrong. It couldn't be more wrong. I just wish people wouldn't talk about things that they really don't understand. Well, that's what I'm going to talk about for now with this book. It is there's a lot more here. Once again, it's The Projection of the Astral Body by Sylvan Muldoon, and Carrington has a foreword, so he's listed as well on the book. Sylvan, by the way, is spelled Sylvan, Muldoon, Muldoon. And yes, it was published back in 1929, but there tends to be reprints on a regular basis. And I wouldn't be surprised if you probably did some searches online. Somebody probably has a PDF if you want to look it up that way. If you like this, please hit the like button, share it with those of like minds, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and ring that bell, because remember, you want to be reminded about those Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time here in the United States videos that will be happening. So there's going to be 2 every week now. If you have any questions or comments, please let me hear them. And as always, I'm Rick, and I will see you on the astral plane.